The spring of 1945 arrived in the English countryside near Winchester, with the kind of tentative warmth that characterized late April. Daffodils blooming in cottage gardens, trees showing the first green of new leaves, rain that fell gently rather than with winter's harsh persistence. At a hastily organized transit facility that had been a girls' boarding school before the war, requisitioned it for military use, British authorities faced an unexpected logistical challenge. Approximately 60 German women, members of auxiliary military services captured during the final Allied push through northern Germany, required immediate housing in a system designed primarily for male prisoners. These women had served in various non-combat roles: radio operators, administrative staff, nurses attached to Wehrmacht medical units, members of the Luftwaffe's signals corps who had been processing communications when their units were overrun by advancing British forces. They had surrendered expecting the worst, carrying assumptions shaped by Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality and by their knowledge of how German forces had treated captured enemies, particularly women from Soviet territories. The facility itself was inadequate for their needs. The boarding school had been converted to administrative offices for military planning staff, with most of the dormitory space already occupied by British soldiers who managed logistics for the occupation forces being assembled for Germany. The commanding officer, a Colonel James Hartley who had spent 4 years coordinating supply operations and understood something about making impossible logistics function through improvisation, received orders that were clear but challenging. House the German women securely and appropriately until permanent facilities could be arranged, provide adequate care, maintain proper separation between enemy prisoners and British personnel, and accomplish all this with resources that were already stretched thin by the demands of managing millions of displaced persons across liberated Europe. Hartley called a meeting of his logistics staff, and the sergeants who supervised the soldiers billeted in the former school. The situation was explained. 60 German women prisoners required immediate housing. The facility had no designated space for female enemy prisoners. Standard procedures offered no guidance for this scenario, and somehow appropriate accommodation needed to be created within 24 hours. The discussion that followed was pragmatic rather than ideological. Where could space be found? What resources existed? How could security be maintained while providing the separated facilities that housing female prisoners required? One sergeant, a man named William Cooper, who had been a school administrator before the war and understood something about managing residential facilities, suggested the obvious solution that everyone had been avoiding. The British soldiers currently occupying the dormitory space could move to alternative accommodation, tents, Nissen huts, any available space that could house troops temporarily, and give their beds to the German women. The suggestion created uncomfortable silence. Soldiers who had been sleeping in proper beds would be moved to significantly less comfortable quarters so that enemy prisoners could have superior accommodation. The optics were problematic, the fairness questionable, the potential for resentment among British troops obvious. But Hartley, calculating quickly, recognized that Cooper's suggestion was not just practical but necessary. The German women could not be housed in tents. Both security and basic decency demanded indoor facilities with proper sanitation and privacy. The British soldiers, all male and mostly young, could manage temporary discomfort of tent accommodation while permanent arrangements were made. The alternative, attempting to create makeshift housing for the German women in spaces that were inadequate and potentially dangerous, violated both military regulations about prisoner treatment and the basic standards that Britain claimed to maintain even toward enemies. The decision was made. The British soldiers would move out of the dormitory facilities within 12 hours. The German women would be housed in the vacated space, provided with beds that British troops had been using, given access to washing facilities that would be designated for their exclusive use, guarded by a combination of male sentries, maintaining external perimeter security, and female personnel from the Auxiliary Territorial Service, who would provide direct supervision and care. When Hartley announced this decision to the soldiers being displaced, the reaction was mixed. Some accepted it with resigned professionalism. Orders were orders, logistics demanded flexibility, and sleeping in tents for a few weeks was minor hardship compared to what they had endured during combat operations. Others expressed resentment more openly. Why should British soldiers sacrifice their comfort so that enemy prisoners, Women who had served the Nazi regime could sleep in proper beds? The questions were legitimate from the soldiers' perspective, reflecting the natural human tendency to resent giving resources to enemies when those same resources were being taken from friends. Hartley's response to this resentment was direct. Because we're British, and we do things properly, we follow the Geneva Convention not when it's convenient but when it's required. These women are prisoners now, not enemies. They're our responsibility. We house them correctly because that's what civilized armies do, even when it costs us something. If you want to complain about sleeping in tents, remember that German prisoners in our custody will eventually go home and tell their people how Britain treated them. Make sure the story they tell is one we can be proud of. The speech was pragmatic rather than inspirational, appealing to professional standards and national reputation rather than to humanitarian sentiment. But it worked. The soldiers began the process of moving their belongings out of the dormitory facilities, stripping their beds of personal items, preparing the space for its new occupants. The mood was not enthusiastic, but it was compliant. Orders had been given, reasons had been explained, and British military culture placed sufficient value on proper procedure that even unpopular decisions were executed once command authority had spoken. The German women arrived at the facility the following afternoon, transported in covered trucks from the temporary holding area, where they had spent the previous 2 days since capture. They emerged into the spring sunshine with the cautious movements of people who had learned not to trust apparent calm, who expected that each transition might bring new threats or degradation. They had been told nothing about where they were going or what accommodated them there, had spent the journey imagining scenarios that ranged from harsh imprisonment to sexual exploitation to summary execution. Nazi propaganda about Allied treatment of prisoners had been comprehensive and terrifying, describing Americans and British as vengeful barbarians who would violate and murder captured Germans in retaliation for German war crimes. The women had no way to know whether this propaganda was true, but their recent experience of war's chaos made any horror seem possible. What they encountered instead was Colonel Hartley standing in the courtyard of a former girls' school, flanked by British soldiers who maintained professional bearing, with several female ATS personnel visible in the background, speaking in German adequate enough to communicate basic information. You will be housed in the dormitory facilities. You will have beds, washing facilities, adequate food. You will be supervised by British female personnel, with male guards maintaining external security. You will be treated according to international law. You will not be harmed. The German women absorbed this information with the kind of skepticism that survival instinct demanded. Promises from captors meant nothing until proven through experience. They were escorted into the building, upstairs to the second floor where dormitory rooms had been prepared. And then they saw what British soldiers had given up for them. The rooms were clean, recently vacated, still showing signs of having been occupied by British troops. A forgotten magazine on one bed, a photograph pinned to a wall that had been missed during the cleanup, a bar of British military soap in one washroom. The beds were made with clean sheets, military-issue blankets folded at precise angles, pillows that showed the indentations of recent use. Washing facilities were functional and clean, with hot water available, towels stacked in quantities sufficient for all 60 women. Windows provided natural light and ventilation, could be opened without compromising security. The space was basic but adequate, institutional but not harsh, the kind of accommodation that prisoners in 1945 Europe rarely experienced. One woman, a former Luftwaffe signals operator named Greta Schneider, who had been captured when her communications facility was overrun near Bremen, stood in the doorway of one dormitory room and simply stared. She had spent the previous 3 days sleeping on concrete floors in temporary holding facilities, had expected that imprisonment would mean deprivation and degradation, had prepared herself psychologically for treatment that would mirror how she knew German forces had treated their prisoners. Instead, she was looking at beds, actual beds with mattresses and sheets, in clean rooms with functional facilities. The contrast between expectation and reality was so stark that processing it required mental adjustment that couldn't happen immediately. Another woman, asking a question in hesitant English that she had learned in school before the war, made such education suspicious, addressed one of the British ATS personnel. "Whose beds are these? Where did the soldiers go?" The question was tentative, probing for information that might explain what seemed too generous to be real. The ATS sergeant, a woman named Margaret Davies who had spent 3 years managing logistics for field hospitals and had no patience for diplomatic evasion, answered directly, "These were our soldiers' beds. They moved to tent accommodation so you could have proper housing. They're sleeping in tents now because the regulations require that female prisoners be housed in secure, indoor facilities with privacy and proper sanitation. This was the only way to provide that quickly." The silence that followed this explanation was profound. The German women processed what they had been told. British soldiers had given up their beds, actual comfortable beds in heated buildings, and moved to tents so that German prisoners, women who had served the Nazi regime, could have superior accommodation. The sacrifice was incomprehensible within the framework that Nazi ideology had provided. They had been taught that enemies existed to be exploited, that the strong dominated the weak, that showing consideration toward defeated foes was weakness that only inferior races displayed. But British soldiers giving up comfort so that German prisoners could have decent housing contradicted every assumption about how power was exercised and what behavior victors displayed toward the defeated. The symbolic object that defined this moment was the bed itself, that simple frame with mattress and sheets that represented the difference between dignity and degradation, between being treated as human being or as thing to be warehoused. The beds had been occupied by British soldiers hours earlier, were still warm from British bodies, were being provided to German prisoners through British sacrifice of personal comfort. Each bed represented not just physical accommodation but moral statement, that proper treatment of prisoners mattered more than personal convenience, that Geneva Convention obligations were real commitments rather than convenient suggestions, that British military culture valued doing things correctly, even when doing so imposed costs. Greta Schneider, standing in that doorway looking at the beds British soldiers had vacated, felt something shift in her understanding. She had served the Nazi regime believing its teachings about German superiority, about the weakness of democratic societies, about the inevitable triumph of will over soft humanitarian sentiments. But British soldiers giving up their beds so that she and the other German women could have proper housing demonstrated something that Nazi ideology could not explain. That strength could coexist with decency, that victory did not require cruelty, that power could be exercised through adherence to standards rather than through exploitation of advantages. The first night in the Winchester facility, the German women slept in beds that British soldiers had given up, under blankets that still smelled faintly of British military soap and cigarette smoke, in rooms that retained traces of the men who had sacrificed comfort for the sake of proper prisoner treatment. The experience of sleeping in an actual bed after days on concrete floors was physically restorative. But the knowledge of how those beds had become available created psychological impact that transcended comfort. These women had been taught that British society was decadent and weak, that British military culture lacked the hardness that made German forces superior, that democratic values were luxuries that serious nations could not afford. But the beds they slept in testified to something else, that Britain valued proper behavior toward prisoners highly enough to impose costs on its own soldiers, that standards mattered more than convenience, that the way a nation treated enemies revealed character that military victory alone could not demonstrate. In the days that followed, as the German women adjusted to the routines of British custody, the significance of that initial gesture, British soldiers giving up their beds, continued to resonate. The food provided was adequate British military rations, plain but substantial, served in quantities that exceeded anything the women had received in the chaotic final months of German military collapse. The medical care offered included treatment for malnutrition and minor injuries, provided by British doctors who maintained professional standards regardless of their patient's nationality. The supervision by female ATS personnel meant that daily interactions did not carry the sexual threat that male guards might have implied, that privacy was protected, that basic dignity was maintained. But underlying all of this was the knowledge that British soldiers had sacrificed their comfort, had moved from heated dormitories to cold tents, so that German prisoners could have proper housing. The gesture was not kind in the emotional sense, it was procedural, following regulations about how female prisoners should be accommodated. But procedures that demanded sacrifice, that imposed costs on British soldiers for the sake of enemy prisoners, demonstrated something about the values that generated those procedures, about what British military culture considered non-negotiable, even when violation would have been easy to justify. Greta Schneider, eating British rations in a room that British soldiers had vacated for her use, found herself revising assumptions about British society that Nazi education had instilled. She had been taught that democratic nations were weak because they placed individual rights above collective strength, that humanitarian standards were luxuries that serious militaries abandoned when circumstances demanded. But British soldiers sleeping in tents so that she could sleep in a bed demonstrated that humanitarian standards were not luxuries but commitments, that maintaining proper treatment of prisoners was considered important enough to impose costs on British troops, that the strength of British military culture included the capacity to enforce standards, even when doing so required sacrifice. The transformation this experience worked on the German women was gradual and varied. Some remained convinced that Nazi ideology was essentially correct, that German defeat was temporary setback rather than fundamental failure, that British generosity was weakness that more ruthless nations would exploit. But others, confronted daily with evidence that contradicted what they had been taught, began questioning assumptions about German superiority and democratic weakness. If British soldiers willingly sacrificed comfort so that enemy prisoners could have proper housing, perhaps democratic values were not weakness but different kind of strength. Strength that came from commitment to principles rather than from willingness to dominate through brutality. The British soldiers who had given up their beds, sleeping in tents in the English spring weather that alternated between pleasant warmth and cold rain, experienced their own complex reactions. Some resented the sacrifice, muttered complaints about giving comfort to enemies while British troops suffered. But others, particularly those who had served in combat and seen what war did to civilians and soldiers alike, found satisfaction in the knowledge that Britain maintained standards, even when doing so cost something. One soldier, writing to his wife about the situation, noted, "We gave our beds to Jerry women prisoners. Wasn't happy about it initially, but then I thought, if our women were captured, would I want them treated properly? And if the answer is yes, then we have to treat their women properly too, even when it costs us something. That's what separates us from the Nazis. We actually follow the rules we claim to believe in." The repatriation that eventually came in the summer of 1945, after Germany's unconditional surrender and the beginning of occupation administration, sent most of the German women back to a homeland that existed now only as zones controlled by victorious powers. Greta Schneider returned to Bremen, found her family's home damaged but intact, her parents alive, her brother missing on the Eastern Front. In the difficult years of occupation and reconstruction that followed, she would tell the story of British soldiers giving up their beds so that German prisoners could have proper housing, would describe the sacrifice as evidence that British values were not weakness, but strength of a kind that Nazi ideology had never understood. The story spread through networks of returned prisoners, gaining variations as stories do, but always centered on that essential fact. British soldiers had given up their comfortable quarters and moved to tents so that German women prisoners could have proper accommodation according to regulations about female prisoner housing. The story became part of the larger narrative of British prisoner treatment, contributing to the gradual process of denazification that came not from official re-education programs, but from accumulated evidence that the ideology they had served had been based on lies about enemy nations and false claims about German superiority. The deeper significance of British soldiers giving up their beds lay in what it revealed about the difference between authoritarian and democratic military cultures. The Nazi regime had taught that strength came from domination, that showing consideration toward enemies was weakness, that the powerful earned the right to exploit the defeated. But British soldiers sacrificing their comfort for enemy prisoners demonstrated that democratic military culture operated from different premises. That strength included the capacity to maintain standards even when doing so imposed costs. That power could be exercised through adherence to rules rather than through exploitation of advantages. That civilized behavior toward enemies was not weakness but commitment to principles that defined national character. The beds themselves, those simple frames with mattresses and sheets that British soldiers had vacated, became symbols of this larger truth. Each bed represented not just physical comfort but moral choice. The decision that proper treatment of prisoners mattered more than personal convenience, that Geneva Convention obligations were real commitments enforced even when violation would have been easy to justify and difficult to detect. British soldiers sleeping in cold tents, while German prisoners slept in warm beds, might have seemed like foolish generosity to those who measured national strength by willingness to exploit advantages. But it was actually demonstration of the strength that came from principle, from the kind of moral confidence that allowed a nation to maintain civilized standards, even toward enemies, even when doing so imposed costs, even when the enemies might never appreciate or reciprocate the gesture. In the end, the sacrifice British soldiers made, giving up their beds so that German women prisoners could have proper housing, mattered not because it changed the war's outcome or because it earned gratitude from prisoners who might never acknowledge it. It mattered because it demonstrated that British military culture valued proper behavior toward prisoners, highly enough to enforce that behavior even when doing so cost British soldiers their comfort, that the standards Britain claimed to maintain were real commitments rather than propaganda, that the way a nation treated vulnerable people under its power revealed character that military victory alone could never demonstrate. And for German women who had been taught that British society was weak and decadent, sleeping in beds that British soldiers had sacrificed represented evidence that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had claimed about the relationship between strength and humanitarian standards, between military effectiveness and civilized behavior, between victory and the choice to treat defeated enemies with the dignity that Geneva Conventions prescribed, and that British military culture enforced even when enforcement required British soldiers to sleep in tents so that German prisoners could sleep in beds.